Joe will be recording. He's our tech guy. Okay. Let me. So, hello and welcome. My name is Emily Taylor, and I am a graduate student in the Department of History at UNC Chapel Hill. I want to begin by welcoming Dr. Garrard, Dr. Nelson, and all of you to Fieldwork in Times of Crisis. This event is sponsored by the Working Group on Gender and Sexuality in Latin America and the Caribbean, a project of the UNC Duke Consortium in Latin American Studies. We will begin with Dr. Garrard's talk on her experiences conducting fieldwork in Guatemala during the internal conflict. We will then move on to specific questions for Dr. Garrard about her presentation and her fieldwork. I have a few pre-submitted questions. We will also open it up for live questions relating to the presentation and Dr. Garrard's research. Finally, we will move to a more open and participatory discussion about challenges of fieldwork in times of crisis. Some of the questions that we may discuss include, what are the ethical implications for both researchers and participants when conducting fieldwork during times of crisis? What are some of the emotional challenges of fieldwork? And how does fieldwork during a time of crisis heighten already disproportionate burdens on researchers with marginalized identities? I want to stress that this is a discussion, and I want to encourage active participation. So we're gonna have Danny has an announcement before we start about our next working group event.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm really excited to announce that it's a little bit far away, but it's never too early to start planning. On April 2nd at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to be hosting Lorraine Bayard-Devolo. Dr. Bayard-Devolo on both Nicaragua and Cuba and women's participation in social movements in both countries. I'm going to drop the link in the chat in just a minute if anyone would like to RSVP. But just wanted to keep you guys posted on that event, which will be happening on April 2nd.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danny. So finally, let me introduce one of my mentors, Dr. Diane Nelson, who will be then introducing Dr. Garrard. Dr. Nelson has been working in Guatemala since 1985. She received her PhD in anthropology from Stanford University in 1996 and has been teaching at Duke University since 2001. Some of her recent scholarship includes Reckoning the Ends of War in Guatemala and Who Counts? The Mathematics of Life and Death After Genocide. With Elizabeth Oglesby, Dr. Nelson co-edited the Journal of Genocide Research special issue on Guatemala in 2016. As you can see from this impressive list, Dr. Nelson is an incredible scholar who has spent decades thinking deeply about Guatemala, and I am honored to be able to introduce her this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Ginny. This is going to be really exciting to hear. I want to say that when I first went to Guatemala in 1985, I was in a very small village outside of the town of Nebac, and the people there told us this very intense story about the army coming in and sort of asking who was in it, who was a Catholic and who was a Protestant, and dividing them and then shooting all the Catholics. And at that point, it was a moment of thinking, oh my gosh, religion is really important for thinking about what's going on. And at that point too, there had been this, vast increase in Pentecostal Protestantism. Everywhere you went in the highlands, you would try to be sleeping, and these horrible people would be having these, ongoing hour after hour, services, everything at like the highest possible volume with these giant like altoparlantes. So like there was nowhere you could go to like escape them, and the noise, and just like on and on and on and on. And until I met Dr. Garrard, I had no idea what to think about these people and what was going on with them. I knew it was important, but I was just like, I can't possibly go to one of those services. I can't possibly talk to one of those people. So I just want to say that there's many reasons that Dr. Garrard's work has been incredibly important for thinking not only religion and politics, fieldwork methods in Guatemala, but also throughout Latin America. But one of the most important is really taking seriously people who are really difficult to understand and difficult to work with. So I'm so pleased to have met you and to have been able to read all of your amazing work. She is not only a really subtle thinker and a creative writer, and I would call her an honorary anthropologist for all the work you've done. That's ethnographic as well as archival. But she's also been extraordinarily committed to institution building and to service. And those of you who had to listen to us like gossiping at the beginning, you know, she was head of the Guatemala Scholars Work for quite a while. She's at UT Austin, has worked at the, I'm always going to say it wrong, it's the LIRR.
LLILAS.
Yeah, LLILAS, sorry. Enforcing this unbelievably important institution and really opening it and broadening it. Her work with the police archives in Guatemala, which I know Emily is very familiar with, has been very important. You know, it's a very vulnerable institution right now, but you made sure that that work was going to be available. Your groundbreaking way you brought your students into thinking with and alongside the folks there by making that part of a class, that kind of institution building, but also community building across borders has always been something that I've really, really appreciated about Dr. Garrard's work. And also really thinking how to think about power in complicated ways. Like not, you know, it's easy to come into a space like Guatemala where it feels like there's some good people and there's some really, really bad people, and having to think that in more complex ways. I really owe that to Dr. Garrard's work. Maybe one of her better known books is her looking into General Rios Montt, his backing and the period under which he ruled Guatemala, terror in the land of the Holy Spirit, which is an amazing book if you haven't read it. But she also has a number of books. I sort of feel like, you know, I can go on and on about this, but thinking about Beyond the Eagle's Shadow, New Histories in Latin America's Cold War, Rethinking Protestantism from Latin America, History of Protestants in Guatemala, Living in the New Jerusalem, Managing to Work with David Stoll, very, very important work. Old book chapters and articles, fellowships, etc. She's an extraordinary intellectual. So I'm really happy to introduce you and welcome you, even though it's in this like slim way, to North Carolina and to share your work with you and everyone here tonight. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nelson, Diane. It's such an honor to be here, and I couldn't have been more pleased to be invited. There are some old friends here. Diane is one, and Matt Sampson is another. I can't see people on the other screen, but that's a real treat. And some new ones. Emily and I met in the summer of 2019 when we were both working in the CIRMA archives. And she was working very diligently, and I kept leaning over and talking to her and interrupting her work. But here I am today. So this is going to be a very personal talk. It's not really about my research so much. I want to talk about my experiences in working in a challenging setting. And let me just, I know that I struggle sometimes to get the shared screen up, but aha, there we go. Can you see that? Is it up there? Okay, good.
Yeah.
First try, excellent. So I want to talk about my experience working in Guatemala in the early 1980s. And so that really is where I'm going to focus it, because I think it'll be of the broadest application to everybody, but certainly because there are such old pros and new pros on hand, I hope this will be a more collaborative conversation than me just, you know, obsequiando. Challenging circumstances. I'm not going to talk about the Guatemalan armed conflict. And in fact, we have Diane Nelson here, who's written, I think, really a definitive book about numbers, counting, which you can find out much, much more, except to say that the period of time that I was first working in Guatemala was during really the nadir of the armed conflict. And I'm a historian, so I was initially working on a very different period of time, but it brought me to this. So, you know, I think it's important to know that at least 100,000 people were killed over the course of the long armed conflict, but the vast majority of them were killed in the about 1978 to about 1986 period. There were waves. It waxed and waned, the violence waxed and waned. It never completely went away, but it got much, much worse during this period known as La Violencia, which was about 1980 to 1984. Most victims were Maya, not all, but most were, and most were men. And so that those are consequences that affected everything. All right, there she is. Not just everybody's going to have their young self right up on the screen next to their old self. It kind of hurts, but I kind of want to give you my positionality then. This is my Sedulo picture from 1983. And so I had long-term periods of field work in 1980, which, if you know Guatemala's history, is a heck of a time to start off in that country. And then I lived there from 1983 through 1985. And then I've gone there, as we were just saying before we started, every year, except the year I had a baby, the year I got divorced, and this past summer. So I plan to get back on it, but these aren't long-term visits, but it's enough to keep in touch. And not having been there the past summer makes me realize how important those are, to keep those connections, to keep those networks going in a way that's hard to do from a distance even now. Okay, so Emily had asked if I had some photographs, and when I lived in Guatemala, we didn't take a lot of photographs. I mean, I had a crummy Instamatic camera. You had to buy the film. You had to send the pictures off to be developed. We weren't really comfortable sending them off to be developed. And even then, they're like this big and unfocused. But Jean Marie Simon, who was and remains a good friend of mine, was a photographer and still is a photographer. And she took thousands of pictures of Guatemala in the early 1980s. And so I was with her in a good many of them. I'm not in them because she wasn't taking pictures of me, although I don't know if you can see over the grid. I want to give myself my authority there. Getting ahead of myself. I'm over in the corner on the picture of the boat, if you can tell me there, tell that I'm there. So I really am there in a lot of these. I'm going to show you just a few pictures just to give you a sense of the lay of the land in Guatemala at that time, because I think this visual record is very useful. And I highly commend to you Jean Marie's book, Guatemala, Eternal Spring and Eternal Tyranny. It's out in multiple different versions now, Spanish, English, versiones populares, hardbacks. It's in all different kinds of versions. But she also has a Facebook page of outtakes. And so I grabbed some of those for this talk. If you know Francisco Goldman, the author of The Long Night of White Chickens, that's who's rowing the boat there in the front, the young Frank. So all of these photographs are Jean Marie's pictures. So again, I just want to give you a sense of the time and place. And so these are Ixio Maya women who were captured by the military or voluntarily, quote unquote, gave themselves up in Izabal. I can't see over them. I think this is 1985. 1985. But I think their pictures really speak volumes, just in and of themselves. And as you probably know already, the Ixil area was the one of the most dramatically affected, and it was the area when Rios Montt was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. It was Ixil's that brought the suit. So the other thing that I would point out about this picture, how many guys do you see in this picture? How many men do you see? None. It's possible it's just a group of women, but my guess is the men are not present any longer, maybe even alive. Shoot. Okay, so here are a couple of other, I think I missed one up there, no. A couple of other pictures just to give you a sense of violence during this era. These are the National Police in 1984 hauling off some poor protester. I couldn't tell you who it is, and I couldn't tell you what his fate is, but now that I've had a chance to look through the National Police's archives with their records, and if you want to see sort of the banality of evil, go through a bureaucratic archive like that, my guess is this guy's day did not get better. And then the other one, obviously, is the EGP. And of course, it's taken in shadows because all of those people would be marked if the pictures were actually, you could tell who they were. I think these are two really haunting pictures that Jean Marie took in Nebach. On my left is an indigenous child mascot, which was not at all uncommon. And of course, he's a little kid, and he's got mustache drawn on him, and he probably is made out to be some character in one of the bailes or something like that, sitting by a very smug army officer. But look at that child's face. It's just harrowing. And then the other one is somebody who's been in one of the bailes. And, you know, the bailes are not just dances, they're stories, and they're a type of kinetic oral history. And I'm not sure, Diane, you or one of you anthropologists out there may know which one this is. I want to say that this is Baile de los Conquistadores, which would certainly be appropriate given that the new conquistadors are standing there in the background, but I don't know for sure. Matt, can you tell if it is? Heather, Diane? But if you just look at the man's face, is this a comfortable occupation? No. And then this is the last one I wanted to show you, which is the Grupo de Apoyo Mutuo, which you may know was Guatemala's equivalent of the sort of the Mothers of the Disappeared, although it's not just women. A very valiant organization that began in the mid-'80s to petition the government to admit to what had happened to all the desaparecidos, all their loved ones who had just disappeared. One of the founders was Rosario Godoy, who I and others knew very well. She was murdered on the 4th of April of 1985. And I remember that phone call very well, hearing that. She's the one with the longer hair in the middle there smoking a cigarette. Well, there are two women smoking cigarettes. So that's Rosario. And then also in April of 1985 was the GAM's first national march, which I can't remember actually if it was before her, oh, it must be after her assassination, because there's her picture right there in the front. But I remember this vividly. We were in it, and it was about a 2-mile march, and nobody was sure what was going to happen when we got in front of the National Palace, if they were going to bring out tanks or machine guns or what. They didn't, but you don't know that in advance. So so this is just that's all I have on the slides, and I'll quit saving a screen, stop the share with you now. But I think that does kind of give you a bit of the sense of the era I was doing my dissertation research. So as Dr. Nelson said, I'm a historian and not an anthropologist. And so I was getting my PhD, my MA, the first time I went was to work on my MA, and then my PhD at Tulane University. And I went to Guatemala the first time in June of 1980, which if you know your Guatemalan history, you'll know that January of 1980 was the date of the Spanish embassy fire. And I was uneasy about that. It seemed like things were going from bad to worse, which they were. And so I asked one of my advisors at Tulane, I said, is it safe to go? And he said, Jenny, if you wait till a safe time to go to Guatemala, you'll never go. And he was right. He actually absolutely was right. It isn't safe. It wasn't safe then. It isn't safe now in a lot of ways. But I will say, if you're going to choose a time to go, that probably was one of the least safe. It was a rough time, and it brought some challenges to the fieldwork, understandably. I think Tulane's history department probably thought that their students would be so busy burying themselves deep in these musty archives. And believe me, those archives were plenty musty at that time, with no air control in the rooms. I would always get a lung funk while I was there from the spores and stuff from the documents. But they thought we would be fine because we'd just be buried in old documents. But the Archivo General de Centroamérica, which is the National Archives of Guatemala, but it's also actually goes back much farther for earlier periods from the Kingdom of Guatemala. It's located in Zone 1. There's the Parque Central, if you've been there. And so it's right on that parque. It's on the backside of the National Library. Zone 1 at the time is now the Centro Histórico, but at the time it was a wild, busy district, and it was not a safe place. I mean, it was crime, but it was also, when you're catty-cornered to the National Palace, you really don't quite know what could happen at any time. And so that in itself was tricky. It wasn't a safe place to live near it, and it wasn't a safe place to walk around in it. But I didn't have a car, so that's what I did. I had also been warned by some prior graduate students that the AGCA had spies in it. They would keep track of foreign students and report back to the government on who we were and what we were working on. I wasn't sure it was true, but subsequently I found out, yeah, it was true. We took notes by hand in those days. God forbid, I just can't even imagine it now, but note cards and different colored markers and things like that. Although the archives had a photocopier that worked when the electricity was on, which wasn't all the time. But any document that you wanted photocopied, you had to take it to a security office. They had to write down what you had chosen and had to be approved for you to even make a photocopy of it. And many, many things, for the life of me, I couldn't see why some of those things were turned down, but they were. One of the things in particular that was touchy was maps. They said, you could easily give this to the guerrillas. Well, I thought, I don't know, the Republic of Los Altos in 1840 is going to be a great interest to them, but there you are. So there was that. All that said, it was not actually the case that historians were safe in the early 1980s. I also used a lot of regional archives in my dissertation, and they took me all over the country, even into areas that were in the zones of conflict, even in areas that were either occupied by the military or there was active fighting going on nearby, and you could hear it. And of course, when you go and are not just buried deep in a National Archive someplace, you get to know people and you see things. And so that kind of thing leads you in a particular direction, right? In your own thinking. And so the other issue to me was that I was not, when I came back, I was there in 1980, and then I left for 81, 82. Because my parents wouldn't let me go back. And then I went back in 1983. So when I returned in 1983, my sympathies were not with the Guatemalan government. And particularly in that intervening 2 years, it had been the period of time where they had started the Scorched Earth campaigns. The massacres had begun. They hadn't stopped, but they had begun. And anybody could see pretty clearly that the government had gone rogue on its own people. I mean, that seemed pretty evident to me. There were still, even along the Pan American Highway, there were burned out buildings and buses and cars and occasionally dead bodies. People were sick and they were gaunt and they were traumatized. I remember going to Panajachel, folks, with some friends. And, that place is packed and touristy and everybody's selling stuff. And my friends and I were the only outsiders there, except for one family visiting from El Salvador. We were it. And people were just desperate to sell us stuff because they were starving. Nos aguantan, and they were. Government propaganda was everywhere. It was painted on rocks. It was painted on mountainsides. And there were some of the regions of the country, you just couldn't go there. You just could not go there. Well, during this period, I had a group of friends who some people would think I was hanging out with kind of the wrong crowd. But to me, they were exactly the right crowd. Man, some of these people. We hung out together, and sometimes we lived together in the same house, and we traveled places together. One One of them was John Burnett, who I ended up being married to for 30 years. He was a reporter then with, they called it the UPI wire service, the only American reporter working full-time in Guatemala during the so-called Central American conflict. I mean, that should make you wonder right there. But so there was John. Another was Francisco Frank Goldman, who was he's now a very prominent Guatemalan American novelist. Brand new book coming out very soon, by the way. But then he was working as a journalist, and he came to us fresh from Nicaragua. And then the other one was Jean Marie Simon, who was officially a photojournalist, but she actually, her primary function, a secret function, was she was working with America Watch as a human rights observer and sending reports back very boldly. I admire what she did very much. Any one of these things was enough to get us in our gang into plenty of trouble with the security forces. Some of the people in our group became involved to a greater or lesser extent with the guerrillas. And that was definitely enough to get you killed. So we believed that to some extent we had some sort of kind of built-in impunity because we were foreigners, and, you know, even better, we were Americans, and it would cause an incident if something happened to us. But in 1980, it was my birthday. It was October 30th of 1985. We had a birthday party, and a Peace Corps worker was murdered leaving John's apartment. And so we realized that sense of impunity was an illusion. But even at that, we felt that and it's true, we were, generally speaking, less vulnerable than Guatemalans. And I think that position of power and privilege through no grace of our own is something that we needed to keep in mind. We tried to do that, but I don't know how successful we were at it. So I wanted to talk about some factors that made research challenging. Research is always hard, no matter what, but I mean, just the archives alone, that was interesting. They had fallen down. I mean, a bunch of documents and papers, they had fallen down during the 1976 earthquake, and somebody had decided that they were going to reorganize them, starting with the colonial period and working their way all the way up to the contemporary period. So I'm working in 19th and 20th century, and they're on the floor in a pile. No index. There was actually a secret index that circulated around as some of the documents, and I had a copy of it. But mainly just had to ask, could you go, and you had to sort of guess, might this be here? Would it not be? So that's a challenge in itself. But given the armed conflict, safety and security were a constant preoccupation and our paramount concern. The idea that you wouldn't make it back. No dissertation's worth that. I tell my students that sometimes when they get into a bind, it's not worth that for your career in academia. I did have for a year, I had a blue Mercedes-Benz that followed me everywhere I went. And that scared me to death. Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua, who had been toppled by the Sandinistas in 1979, he had owned the only car dealership in Nicaragua, which was Mercedes-Benz. Now, who in Nicaragua at that time was going to buy Mercedes-Benz? Somoza. So, you know, that car had a strong association with death squads in the right wing, and it scared me to death. And I think that was the idea. I wasn't really a problem, but they didn't want to scare me. They wanted to keep me keep me in line. But that was unsettling. Another issue, and I'm sure Matt and Diane, when you got there, it was this way too. They had a lot of apagones. That is, the electricity would go out all the time. And a lot of the problem there was that the guerrillas would blow up the electric pylons, which was very effective because it would throw everybody out of whack for as long as it took to get them fixed. We were on a periférico one time, you know, one of those skylift things with somebody's child. We were giving them an outing, and then the ones could last a couple of days. And so we're halfway up this mountain and they had one, and we just thought, what's going to happen here? But it turned out it was only maybe an hour, long enough to get your attention, but not too terrible. That is when I learned to save often when you're writing something on your computer. Learned that the hard way. 1980 was 4 years after the big earthquake of 1976 that killed so many people, and a lot of things just still didn't work. Even in Guatemala City, you could have running water maybe twice a day, no matter where you live. Even people in fancy homes and apartments, it just wasn't there. And of course, if you weren't somebody who lived in a fancy place in Guatemala City, you could be sure that you better have your rain barrel out. And during dry season, you were just out of luck. A lot of the towns had not been fully rebuilt or even a little bit rebuilt. There were still a lot of shanty towns outside of Guatemala City, people who had just lost their homes in the earthquake. And they were still having aftershocks, which wasn't kind of nerve-wracking enough. Sort of major aftershocks to an earthquake sort of turned it up a notch for us. Where am I going with this? That is 3. Communications, I can't really emphasize this enough, and my students look at me like, are you kidding me? You know, how old are you? But my first trips well predated the internet, email, cheap international phones, cell phones, cable TV. If you wrote a letter to go home to the United States, it could take a couple of months to get there. And if somebody wrote you, odds were you weren't going to get it at all. There was a place called Guatel. Anybody remember that? It was a bank of telephones. It would be in a town, and they would be the phones of the town. You would go and use it. There was a worker there who could overhear every single thing you said. And if you needed to receive a call, good luck. Not easy. There was also one phone book that they had had for 10 years. And so if you moved to a new place, you just get the phone number of the people who'd lived there before, and people had to know that that was the phone number that you used. Not easy to navigate at all. You could get, if you were lucky, a week-old Miami Herald if you lived in Guatemala City. And then the Guatemalan media was heavily censored, particularly under the Rios Montt regime. So you really had to get all your information from whispers and gossips and gossips too, and somebody who just you could trust and could tell you what was going on. But if you read what the Guatemalan newspapers, and I did, pardon the expression, religiously every day after 1973, 73, and 83, you would have literally no idea that there was some sort of war going on unless you knew how to read between the lines. It was there, but it wasn't there for all to see. So, you know, fake news and no news at all very much clouded everything. So I'm going to, keeping track of our time, I'm using up our time, answering your questions. Somebody asked, what'd you do to prepare yourself to go to Guatemala? I would say I was very prepared academically. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew where to go to find it. I had to go about doing that. That was great. But emotionally and personally, not even a little bit, not even a little bit. You know, you saw that young girl there. I was 25 I was 20 the first time I went to Guatemala. Had no business being there. I had not seen, you know, I grew up in a small town, white, female, I wouldn't say coddled, but certainly not exposed to anything like I was about to see there. I was not used to violence on a regular basis. I was not used to silences and sort of working through the silences that people have when they can't talk. The constant vigilance, the ever-present kind of pit in the stomach feeling that you would have. And, you know, just a field work issue. I was not at that point ready for the reality of living out every day in every single transaction in Spanish, which in my case needed a lot of work at that time. Some of you know me, so it still does, but it's a lot better than it used to be. That I found that people find that shocking when they go out into the field, that, you know, they feel like they're good in the language of their research. And then it's, I've got to pay the electric bill in this. It is a surprise. I had talked at length before I left to other graduate students, and certainly to my dissertation director, who had a long experience in Guatemala. And so I asked advice very freely and got good advice, pointers of just how to get by. How do you navigate the archive? How do you identify spooky people? How do you know who to trust, who not to trust? As much as anybody can tell you that. Places to stay, places that weren't safe to stay, places to eat. Diane, you introduced me to that great place over by the archives. I've forgotten what it's called. That was later, but it was excellent. Lots of good tidbits that you just need people to point out to you. And so I was prepared on that, but emotionally, not even close. Not even close. When I came back in 85, I had never had a cavity in my mouth, in my teeth. And I had nine cavities. And the dentist said, "Have you been stressed a lot lately?" You could say so. Yeah, I have. But it was just that constant churn, that constant churn. Asian gender, let me say a few things about that. These were big issues for me. I was young and I was tall and I was a gringa, and it's before Diane got there, so there weren't that many people like me in the whole country. In 1980 in particular, there were very few foreigners in the country. It's hard to imagine a town like Antigua, which is basically Disneyland of Guatemala now. Love Antigua, but it is full of language schools and foreigners of every stripe and tourists galore and busloads of people. There were maybe 10 expats that lived there, maybe. I mean, you could know every single foreigner, and a lot of them had been there for a long time. They'd been there in the Peace Corps and just stayed. So I just stood out like a sore thumb. And then when I would go out on my own, the idea that I was unmarried, I was there on my own, that I was doing some kind of weird research that people didn't really quite understand what it was. And, I was working on Protestantism. So people would say, "Do you work with a church?" "No." Is it church work?" "No, it's not church work. It's about that." Well, it was just absolutely incomprehensible and incredulous to people. It was just something that did not happen. I remember thinking, I remember this very vividly, because, I'm talking when I'm in my early 20s to mid 20s, thinking, I don't see any women who are my age. Nobody is my age. Maybe guys, but no women. And then I realized it was probably two things. One is we just probably didn't look the same age. But the other thing was anybody my age was home with their children. And I wasn't anywhere close to that at that moment. The other piece of that was in Guatemala City. There were so many foreigners. The foreigners who were there very often were not doing what they said they were doing. I mean, that was a given. And so people either assumed I was on one side or the other. Either I was a very unsettled CIA agent, or I was doing something for the US government, or I was a human rights spook, or taking liberal money to guerrillas or something like that. It just nobody could quite accept the status quo. So with my own subjectivity being the person that I am or was, I'm not sure that's still me, but part of it's still me. I was very uncomfortable and outright scared a good bit of the time in a lot of situations. I'll admit that now. At the time we're like, "Oh, no, certainly not." But I was scared. I was grinding my teeth to the bone. I rode a lot of public buses back then. And one of the things that used to I just hated it. And it didn't just bother me, it scared me. There would be guys who would ogle and make piropos, and sort of look with a sexy guy look. Oh yeah, I'll go home with you because you got such a sexy look on your face. No. And sometimes they'd get off when I got off and they would follow me. And I will say, if we have time, I did eventually develop a very helpful deterrent for that kind of behavior, which I share with my female graduate students now. And I'll tell you what it is. It's a finger hard up the nose and dig for all you're worth, and people will leave you alone. I promise you that. So if you get nothing else, you've got that now. I've also had a conversation about these things with other women who went to Guatemala for the first time when they were young, and they aren't young anymore. And in retrospect, you realize that you have this kind of power in certain ways as being assumed to be a naive girl, and I use that word intentionally, making you seem less suspicious, or making men more eager to want to please you, give you what you want, give you what you're asking for. Even that is paper in the archives. That actually, finally, somebody told me I could not get papers delivered to me in the archives. It was the most annoying things. And finally, somebody said, this is the problem. And so I wouldn't, that you're not playing the game. I said, I don't even know what the game is. And it wasn't that I became a flirtatious little thing, but I would smile more and I would just be a little more girly to suit my ends. It's a power that probably would have exploited it more if I knew it was in there. But I do think it's a very dangerous, queasy trade-off. You can play that game, but there are consequences to that game. And I will say, I don't miss that at all about being young. To lose that particular vulnerability, there are others, but to lose that one, I am happy to have it gone. I still feel trapped in hotel rooms at night when I'm traveling alone because I can't go out. Okay, there's a question here. Could you please discuss your experience navigating Catholic and evangelical spaces? Do tensions between these groups affect how you're perceived and what information was made available to you? And that is a really good question because the difference is vast. Like I said, my dissertation was on Protestantism, as has been a lot of my work since then. And it's a topic I hit upon because of all the little bitty churches, evangelical and Pentecostal churches that sprouted up between 1980 and when I got back in 1983. I just thought, what is this? They weren't there before. And I came from a church background. My father was a minister, in fact, but he was a minister of a very different, progressive, socially liberal denomination. And so a lot of the Protestants, Matt excluded, I ended up working with were suspicious of me really because of that. It's kind of an indexicality that they could read that I was the wrong kind. And it took a while. I did know how to switch into that code. And I did know how to speak their language, as it were. I'm talking about hardcore evangelicals and Pentecostals. And ultimately that proved to be helpful. And I think one of the things that was helpful to me on that was that even though many of them were very afraid that I was going to dump on them, there had been a NACLA article, and I think about 1981, about evangelicals in Latin America that seared them pretty good. It was prophetic in a lot of ways, actually. And then David Stahl, once again, all things come back to David Stahl. His first book was called Fishers of Men or Founders of Empire, about the Wycliffe Bible translators. And he just finished it. And people were afraid I was going to burn them. And I said, no, that's not what I'm here. And I think they could, I did, and I do feel a lot of empathy for indigenous converts whose lives back then had just been completely destroyed by the violence. They had lost everything. And so they found a way through membership in the churches and through, I think, the spiritual solace they found in the churches to begin to reconstruct and make order out of their lives. And I respected that. And I think eventually people could see that in me. I like to think that. Although I do remember there was one evangelical American who taught at the seminary in Guatemala City, and I was talking to him, and he said, let me tell you something. There are little Episcopal chapels up there in El Quiche, like supply stations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He was like, oh, brother. So it didn't always pay off, but be that as it may. As for Catholics, I found them in a lot of ways easier to deal with in a certain way, especially at first. I had been, I don't want to overstate it because I don't want to make it. Anyway, I had been kindly befriended by a Catholic priest by the name of Stanley Rother in 1980. We had just kind of hit it off. And he was assassinated in 1981. And so I think people could pick up my sympathies in that direction pretty quickly, that wasn't very hard to read. But it was a truly awful time for Catholics in those early years. It was during that time that Bishop Garrard, who later was assassinated himself, shut down the entire diocese of El Quiche in order to assure that no more of his clergy and catechistas would be killed. Didn't work, but it was a good effort. So at the time, Catholics were really living in this, they call it the Church of the Catacombs, and it really was. People who were there were trying to lay really very low. Later on, after I had written my first book about Protestantism, it became more difficult to connect with Catholic interlocutors because they thought I was kind of a partisan about it, until they decided that I was genuine and that they could trust me. So I one of the great ones that would not talk to me, though, is a guy named Tomas Garcia, who was the father of my enculturation, Teología de Maíz. And he had been sent into parochial exile in Almalonga by the 1990s, and which was the worst place because it was almost 100% Protestant town. So he was a Catholic priest there. And he was just like, yeah, I know who you are. So didn't happen. So do you see any parallels between navigating fieldwork during an internal conflict and fieldwork during COVID-19? I had to think about this for a minute, but I think it's a great question because I don't think the similarities are obvious, but they absolutely exist in important ways. I think the most important similarities have to do with silences. Again, I keep mentioning that, but I think reading through the silences is one of the most important things we do. Fear, that's actually real. It's not an existential fear, it's actually fear. and there's a reason for it. Uncertainty, a sense that the grown-ups aren't in charge, or if they are, you don't want them. A lack of access and freedom of movement to get to your research when you want to go to it. I think another point of similarity is that of distrust and fear of other people who, under other circumstances, you wouldn't be afraid of them at all. Or you actually might find common cause with them. But you're so unsure, you're on such unlevel footing, such icy footing, that you don't know who you can trust, or people you thought you could trust, you cannot. The other is the lack of clarity and uncertainty about how long it goes on. We didn't know then, we don't know now. So how long is this an hour long, or is this an hour and a half?
I think we can go for an hour and a half if that works for folks.
Well, I've got some questions that had already come in, so I'll go through those, and then if you all get sick of me, you can just. So somebody asked, it's from a faculty member, says, what are some ways to mentor students through this moment? I think this moment and every moment, I mean, we've had to do, oh my gosh, we have had to do so much sort of looping back around. I mean, at University of Texas in our graduate program, one of the things I'm really proud of is I can't take credit for it. I've contributed to it, but it sure isn't, you know, I'm not going to take credit at all, but almost all of our MA students and PhD students are people of color, people from underrepresented communities, and which is incredible. I mean, I keep saying the arc of justice bends toward graduate students from underrepresented communities. And I like that. I'm glad I've gotten to see that over the course of my career, because it sure wasn't true earlier on. But a lot of our students, we found in a real bind this past summer because they didn't have any money. They couldn't go back to their home countries. They weren't eligible because so many of them are from Latin America. They were not eligible for any US funds. They can't work because of the terms of their visa. And so we had to get the Tinker Foundation to agree to use the money they were going to use for research to support our students over the summer. And it took some doing, but it was worth it. But we do have, and you all probably do too, we have workshops for graduate students before they go, not about methodology. They have that in their disciplines, of course, but about just the nuts and bolts of field work. And we have, just some of the stuff we've been talking about here, but also for women and non-binary people, we have a special one because they face additional challenges that people who aren't likely or not as likely, not to say they won't, but those are the people who are more likely to run into difficulties that are very serious, not just inconvenient and uncomfortable, but actually serious. So we try to really keep an eye on our students in a way that you couldn't do back when I was doing this. I know I try to meet with my students doing field work a couple of times a month at least. Some of them really want more, and I'm happy to do it. Some of them want less, but they get that much because I'm actually, at least is probably more interested in just sort of assessing how they're doing, their kind of mental health. We'll figure out their dissertation eventually. That's going to happen. But some of these topics are really hard. They're really hard and they take a lot out of you. And you can't just sort of do it day after day after day without debriefing with somebody that you can speak freely with. And so I feel like that's something that's enormously important. And it's something that would have been nearly impossible when my dissertation director came down to visit a couple of times while I was in the field because he was doing his own research. But and I love him to death, but we didn't have that kind of rapport either. That just wasn't how that would have worked. So it's one of the questions is, how does fieldwork during a time of crisis heighten already disproportionate burdens on researchers with marginalized identities? I would say in general, everything's harder. And you add a pandemic and a world economic crisis on top of it, it's worse, right? So as I say, I'm so happy to see so many people from underrepresented groups and places getting these degrees. It's not about people anymore, it's with people. And man, that is a great improvement. That is such a great improvement. I think one of the greatest events I've ever been to, Diane, you were there, I think you were there last summer when Nora England was awarded by all the people she had trained Maya scholars to study Mayan languages. It was fantastic. There were, they had a slideshow of books she'd written and then that her students had written, her Maya students had written, not the others. I was just there because I'm her colleague at UT and they wanted me to say something. And then, but her students, her students, her students, and it was over 200 books, all by Maya scholars. it gives me goosebumps to talk about that now. I mean, that's just phenomenal. And that's something that wouldn't have happened before. I think, to me, some of the takeaway, there's more here. I would say too that, and I don't know how it is at your elite universities, because being at a big public university is different. Well, UNC is public, isn't it? But we have a lot of students who are first generation PhD students, which, you think about it, here's somebody whose parents maybe have a second grade education. This person is getting a PhD. Do not sneer. This is big. But they're first generation. A lot of them are Central, or a lot of my students are Central American. And they bring a whole different set of gifts and issues to the program. One being that their parents are thinking, why don't you go get a job? And they don't have, for example, if you're stuck in Austin, Texas over the summer, they don't have a family to pay their rent. Usually they're not in a position to do that. But the other thing that's, I think, more important than that is very often they return to Central America to study where their family came from. I've got a student right now who's Xinca, and she's born in LA, but she's Xinca, and she says, she keeps reading about how the Xinca are extinct and the language is extinct, and she keeps saying, "We're right here." Come to my house. We're right here. But they have, very often they'll get to the place that their family came from, and they'll realize that they're ni aquí ni allá. They are neither here nor there. They've always thought of themselves as Central Americans, or my mom's Salvadoran, my dad's Guatemalan, while they live in the United States. And then they get there, and they're gringos, and they maybe Spanish may be their first language, but usually have an American accent, and an American way of being. Their epistemology is that of a Central American, not of a Central American. And it can be enormously disorienting for people. It's also very hard when people stay with their family, because the expectation is that you're going to be full in Central American style, all in, and that's not their expectation. And they need to do their work, and they can't go to Tio Juan, Second Son, Quinceañera. No, that wouldn't be right. Maybe it would be. We don't know about Tio Juan. But anyway, it gets complicated. A lot of our students, I don't think they would mind me saying this, they're the products of the 1980s. They weren't born, most of them, but their parents came up then, and the issue of intergenerational trauma is a factor, and a lot of times fieldwork can kick that up in somebody. Again, I do my best to mentor students who I've seen it enough that I can kind of see it coming a lot of the times. But am I the best person to do it? I can do the best I can, but I think not really. I don't think I am the best person to do it. The next question is, how do we navigate spaces as a US-based researcher in a country where the US government has sowed chaos and caused violence? Good question. And as a historian, that hits you square in the face. I remember doing a project, a USAID contract project about women's political empowerment with Irma Alicia Otsoy some years back. And she said, and it was USAID paid for it. And she said, well, they ought to pay for it because they basically screwed everything up. And so it's the least they can do. It's blood money. And I thought, I can't really deny that. And I can see why you have the qualm. But my answer to that is with humility, with knowledge and humility. I think recognize and honor the harm, the damage. Don't pretend like it didn't happen. But on the other hand, don't let your work be paralyzed by it, because then you can't do it. You gotta kind of free up your psyche enough to do it. Somebody asked about the ethical implications of researchers and participants. And there are people here who can answer this better than I can, but I would say 3 things in particular. One, if you're doing research during a time of crisis, people are hurting. You may be hurting. You may be scared, but if you're not from the place, just know they're hurting more. No matter how big it feels to you, it's bigger to them. Don't do anything that's going to make their situation worse, now or later. Some of you know Giovanni Botts, who I'm very happy is a graduate of our program, and he came and spoke to my graduate seminar yesterday about the ethics of doing field work in the AHPN. And he was talking about this project he'd started to do about this little boy. He's probably 9 years old in this picture, and his photograph is up there with all these criminals. And so Gio decided to sort of research it. Well, he found out a lot about it. And then he realized the guy could still be alive. He certainly could have children and grandchildren who are alive. So do I want to sort of have my precious project and to publish this at his expense? And Gio still doesn't know, who would be affected by it, but you have to think about those things. Even historians have to think about these things. So a lot of people like to work in the 17th century. They're all dead, you know it. But I think that's my rule number 1. Where are the other ones? I've lost my rules.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and let people ask some questions? I think.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Sure.
Yes, so let's open it up to the group of if anybody has any questions. I know that there was just so much wisdom and so many I was just blown over time and time again. So I feel so honored to have been witness to this. But yeah, so let's open it up to the group. You can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can put it in the chat if you're not comfortable.
I see there are some things in the chat, so let me look over there. Oh, there's my link. I have a brand new book that I'll try to plug for you. But it really is more about religion. In fact, it's right here behind me. So what do you think of your questions? Matt was one of my readers, I think. Ta-da! There it is. Woohoo! Finally out. Matt's talking silently. You're muted, Matt.
Just congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you, Diane. Yeah, I'm glad to have it done. But any questions or comments or pushback from anybody?
Yeah, I have a question. First of all, thank you so much. This is so fascinating. I feel like I could listen to you talk all night. This is so interesting. I really appreciate your perspective as a woman, because I think, sometimes in the field, it can be quite intimidating to be a single woman out, by yourself, kind of having to fend for yourself. My mom went through something similar as a journalist in Brazil, but she had my dad. So to hear these stories from someone who has been through this as a single woman, I think is just so interesting. So thank you. And I guess my question would be, I guess maybe this is kind of a silly question, but I know sometimes as the researcher, you can kind of absorb a lot of trauma and a lot of pain and telling people stories and listening to them, sometimes these things can be challenging. I was just wondering how you took care of yourself in the field, how you kind of were able to ground yourself. You mentioned being scared and anxious a lot, which, I can't even imagine. But was there anything that kind of helped you to sort of cope as you were doing this challenging work?
Well, we didn't talk as much about self-care back then, and I had they weren't stern, but they were definitely Midwestern spit on it and run a lap kind of parents, don't wallow in things. And so I didn't, at that point in my life, really have the tools. I did know to rely on friends, which is why I felt like I needed to mention this group of friends because they were so important to me. They were my debrief people. And so that was very helpful. But I will say this, it's not all gone. And I don't want to, you hear people talk about PTSD. I wouldn't call it that. My dad was a World War II veteran and he did have PTSD. So I don't want to compare it to that. But there are things that will come back to me. There are, when I was writing my Real Smart book, there was a chapter about, I described one massacre in it. I didn't want just massacre after massacre because, it gets lost in numbers. Diane can tell us about that. And so I wanted to just describe one, and I had it from several different points of view. And so I would work on that, and then I just have to put it down and think, okay, that's enough for today. I can come to this later. I'm going to go on a walk. I'm a big knitter now. I'm going to go, I have to have something right here. Just those things that comfort you, whatever your comfort things are. Matt would say you probably wouldn't have had a glass of wine. Matt would be correct. Not so much then, but I would now. But I will say, since Jean Marie Simon has been putting up these old pictures on Facebook, I mean, this is recently, and this is a long time has passed. I'll see something and it'll just be, it'll really strike me in the heart, and I can feel my heart race a bit. And it's a long time later. I think you really have to just acknowledge your feelings. I once had a spiritual director who said, she was Irish, you must consent to your feelings. And I think that's good advice. Sometimes you do have to consent to your feelings. But you have to have something that allows you to be free. I mean, the other thing, and this actually was in my 3 things that I forgot. I always had the luxury of being able to go home. I could go back to the United States. And I didn't do it very much. I mean, the terms of my fellowship didn't allow it, but I knew if it got really bad, I could just get up and go. In fact, my then boyfriend, he did have to leave. He actually did have to leave. And he just, we didn't even have the money for him to buy a ticket, but we had a friend who turned out to be a spy for Cuba, of all things, because she was our buddy. And she happened to have, $700 in $100 bills. And she said, here, take it and go. That's what it's for. And so he did. But, the people who live there, they don't have that luxury. I mean, plenty of people did leave, but generally speaking, that's not a luxury most people have. And I do remember I would watch Guatemala City as I'd fly out, and it's spread out, you know what it looks like. It's just a jumble of stuff. And then I would fly into Dallas, and Dallas is the most gridded out city. It was square, and there'd be pool, and park and highways. And I don't feel this way anymore when I come back to the United States, I will say, but I would feel like I'm safe now. And that was helpful. But I do think that that's one reason why journalists in particular who go to one thing after another, it eventually takes a toll in a way that they don't realize. That's why a lot of them drink way too much and have lifestyles that maybe aren't all that healthy. And I think it just sneaks up on you because you're trying to feel good again. You want to do that thing that makes you feel good again, and you won't be afraid.
Could I add something to Danny's question and your beautiful remarks, Jenny? Thank you. To me, the way to sort of deal with the fact that so much horrible stuff has happened in probably many of the places that all of us work, including the US, but is to realize that even though really terrible things have happened to people there, they also do really fun things, like as much as possible. And like to go to the parties or, I ended up doing Taekwondo in Guatemala City. And so having friends who had nothing at all to do with my work or, you know, the academic project, having this physical relation to people, getting my nose broken, you know, all these ways in which you're just living, right? You're not in that, because part of it is also maybe even more for anthropologists, you're always participating and observing. So you're kind of in it, but you're always out of it. And so you're in this, you know, ni aquí ni allá. But those are places where you can just be there, right? Because it's not about your work. And do art if you can. We put together a singing group, you know, that performed around, and that, you know, and that was again something that fed you and was very powerful, but it like wasn't the work. And so it was a way of being with people you weren't always having to pay attention to. So to me, that was really
really good, Diane. I agree with you 100% about that. And I think anthropologists do have it a lot worse than almost anybody else, because you're working all the time. But I think that's also something to think about as a graduate student, even if you're not doing field work. You're living your life as you're doing this thing, and you get one shot at it. And so if you're just, and it's hard, you know, you get all these accolades and approval for doing your work, right? But if you're not living your life and doing those other things, you aren't living a full life, and it's hard to catch up with it later. I believe that very fiercely. And my colleagues say, don't tell him to do that. Don't tell him to go do that thing. I say, no, I disagree.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And, you know, so important to get out and do other things. I was just remembering a conversation that Diane and I had back in, I don't know, I remember it was really hot outside. So probably like August or September. And we were talking about how when we get to field work and it's so hard, we gaslight ourselves by saying, oh, but it's not as hard. Like, I am covering this trauma, but like I don't have the right to feel this, and kind of like interrupting that. I don't know if either Dr. Garrard or Dr. Nelson, either of you guys want to speak on that, or anyone, if you want to speak on that.
Oh, that is so, I mean, I'll say, but Diane should talk about it too. That is so true. That is so true. I was actually reading something in the Times recently about the pandemic, that, you know, everybody's thrown off by the pandemic. And maybe you didn't have COVID. Maybe you don't know anybody who's died, but you're still thrown off. And then, and they were saying that therapists are really having trouble getting people to do the work they need to do, because they'll do exactly that sort of thing. Say, oh, but I don't have the right to feel that way. Consent to your feelings. Because it does bring, you know, you don't want to overplay your role or your agency in something and pretend like you're the savior of the Guatemalan armed conflict, but it does affect you. I mean, if you had told me in 1983 that I would be talking about this in 2021 in doing related work, I would have been shocked and horrified, honestly. I would have thought, you mean, but I can't stop. I just can't stop. Diane, you have something. Yeah, here, read that out loud, because that's so good. Diane Professor Nelson.
Sorry, I'm having to unmute. Yeah, this is from Zadie Smith, her book Intimations. But it says exactly this, right? You never know what is hurting other people. And you all can read it in the chat, but
very good. Yeah.
It cannot be, yeah, how does one, yeah.
You know, the other thing that this is something I just wonder about in general terms, it has to do with this, has to do with a lot of things, but there are some people who are traumatized by events and things that have happened to them, things that they've witnessed, and justifiably so. And then there are other people who go through the same experiences, and for whatever reason, they just march on. And I don't know if it's, you know, one doesn't know, is it sublimated? Do they have some sort of resiliency that somebody else doesn't have? And if they do, why is that? And so you don't know what hurts other people. But you've got to respect it. You've got to respect what hurts. Well,
thank you.
And I just bring up, I'm coming from an archaeological perspective, working in Guatemala for 20 years. I have never thought about or considered any of the actual trauma that I've been dealing with for the last 20 years. And so it is still around, but anyway, this is, I'm thinking about all of this and recontextualizing it for the first time. So thank you.
I'm glad it kicked it open. I mean, because I think it's always in there. Yeah, I was in a car accident in 1974, and I hurt my neck, and I was, I was a ninth grade. Everybody knows how old I am because I put it up there. But no, I was driving, so I must have been like just 16, and it all got taken care of. But I've had neck problem recently, and I said it couldn't be that. It was so long ago, and they said, oh no, every trauma to your body is always in your body. It's always there, and sometimes it doesn't ever show up again, but it's still there, and then sometimes it does. And I think emotional trauma and psychological trauma is probably like that, but some people deal better by not dealing with it. That's their way. That's the greatest generation's way. But we're a much more empathetic and sort of, I don't know, exculpatory group generation, a couple of generations of people.
I'll jump in here for a second based on a couple of things you said, but I'm going back to some of the things you said earlier. But I think one of the things when you're in these contexts and even related to trauma, particularly in situations where populations are divided between the military and the people who are impacted by the military's actions, between Protestants and Catholics, we're often taught to be so objective, but the fact of the matter is a lot of us when we're in the field, we have to take sides, and that's not often recognized. And I think when you're thinking about trauma and how you deal with it, you may be dealing with your own trauma, but how are you dealing with those other people's trauma that you're thinking about? And I go in the field a little bit later. Very first time I met both Professor Burnett and Professor Nelson, I was at a conference in 1993 in Antigua, and they were giving papers based on their field work, and I hadn't gotten that far yet. So we also rely on the shoulders of those people who've gone before us, who've kind of navigated things that we don't always know about, even in those particular moments. But I think the other thing, you were talking about doing field work with people. And one of my favorite words in Spanish is convivencia. And I, of course, approach that theologically as well as anthropology. But this idea of living with people, we always have to decide. Sometimes we have choices, but we also, at different points, decide who we're going to live with and how we're going to live with them. And I think that's a really important notion in terms of how we make our local contacts and how we are going to develop those relationships over time. And I think that's particularly true. You had the COVID question earlier, because in Guatemala, a lot of people feel like having COVID is a stigma, apparently, from what I'm hearing second, third hand at this point. And I think these are really important issues that we unpack at a moment, maybe when we go into the field, but over time, we sometimes have to reevaluate those relationships and those commitments that we're making. And we learn that from other people who've gone before us, but we're always having to do that for ourselves as well. So I'd just throw that in there.
I think that's exactly right. And I think we also learn it from people who come after us, that people will have an entirely new take. And you think, that's right. Of course. I never saw that, but it was right there in front of my eyes. So I do see scholarship as something that's very collaborative, and I'm honored that you call me an anthropologist, because that's been very important to me. I'm not an anthropologist. I did actually have a lot of anthropology in graduate school, but I'm not an anthropologist. And but because there's so much to learn from that field, and so much to, I feel like history and anthropology just go like this. And I see more and more anthropologists working on the 19th century and more historians working on the 21st. So, there we are, but we're not in any kind of vacuum. And one of the great strengths is that there are more and more Guatemalans who are weighing in with us. It took a long time. It has taken a long time for that to be a reality. They've had scholars a long time, but I think there are two factors, at least in my field. One is that we were very rarely reading each other's stuff, and that's a problem. But the other thing was, in the 80s, the historians of Central America were either involved in the armed conflict as guerrillas, or they were in exile. And so whole facultades de historia were shut down for years. And so, if any of this kind of work that we're all doing contributes to the recovery of this, it's all to the better.
I think Carmen's had a question for a bit. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Karen. And yes, I was sharing earlier that I was born in El Salvador, but my country of research is Guatemala. And I did dissertation work actually in 2011, 2012, and then the Fieldwork project in 2016, 2017. I'm going to put in the chat my contact information in case anyone would like to talk. But on the ethical issues that in the question that came up earlier, for me had to do with the fact that, when we go and research in a country, there is a delicate tension in terms of, being perceived as one more colonialist. For me, it was very important to actually engage with the scholars in Guatemala, so that, and to collaborate with them, look for ways to not to extract information and then come back, and just be another imperialist, right? But academic imperialism, which is what there's a lot of talk about among groups who are being asked questions and studied and that sort of thing. So there's an ethics committee which I've been involved with the Universidad del Valle de Guatemala, with whom I did my dissertation research, and they are willing to consider actually dissertations or research projects that others from outside may be doing. So there is a process in place for considering ethical issues and being engaged in research, especially now. But I wanted to ask the question about, to anyone really, the conditions now under COVID, because I'm involved with scholars, and they're all like in their homes and working. They're not able to reach actually the communities and so forth. But what does fieldwork look like right now? Or there's none. That's kind of my question.
Well, that's the thing, is everybody's in their home. I've basically been sitting in my house a year, and it's archives are closed. If you're a historian, face-to-face work in communities is not very viable. And that's true with Guatemalans too. I've got some people I've been working with, and that we've just kind of shut things down until, the sort of academic extractive industry is is more shut down than I've ever seen it actually right now. And so I wonder when, after the great pause, as my cousin calls it, I like that, if we'll see new ways of doing things. But I don't know. You know, it's hard to say. I do want to say something about it because the extractive element of it is something that I'm passionate about. Because we build our careers off of other people and another country, other circumstances. We come in with highly privileged positions. We have fellowships, we have nice paying jobs, we have the time to do it. We have all these good things. And then we come back and then we get a book out and everybody goes, oh, good for you. And you get promoted and, you know, and there you are. So what do they get out of it? Well, that's a good question. I do feel like at the very, very, very least, you need to make sure that your work appears in Spanish, at the very least. And there's a lot more you can do from that. But that's one reason why GSN is so important to me, is that that's a place where you can have those meaningful collaborative interactions and people are all on the exact same playing field. And I think that's really neat.
In my case, actually, the dissertation work is in a book in Spanish, and I mean, I have copies actually. If you want to send me an email, and because they are for advocacy, and I did give them to the government and to the agencies that had to do with illegal adoptions and the commercialization of children, the trafficking of children for different reduction, which was my dissertation. So, yeah.
Well, I do have I know I
give
can't
back. Yeah.
No, I can't keep you on here all night, but I'm enjoying it so much I don't want to go. Plus, I've been in my house for a year, so it feels like Christmas to me. But but anyway, Giovanni Bazzo, I mentioned before, he had done his dissertation research in Cotzal, and he'd been very active with Ishio University and with the Alcaldía. And so he asked if, when he defended it, he said, you know, I want to give a presentation of my work to the community, and I don't want to defend until they've signed off on it, which was super cool. And we said, absolutely, go ahead and do that. And so he did. And so he did he wrote his dissertation in English, but he did a shorter version in Spanish. The part, you know, he left out the literature review and stuff like that. He figured they weren't going to be very interested about it. And then he doesn't speak Ishio himself, but he has somebody translate sort of a long abstract of it into Ishio. So the elders of the community, he said, I want them up at my defense in Austin. And so we did it. And it was super cool. And they lit the candles and they set off a smoke alarm and we didn't care. And, you know, so it was a very important thing. And they wore their red ceremonial jackets and their hats. And it was fantastic. But the thing is, we thought it was going to be sort of a performative participation in his doctoral defense. Well, it wasn't. And so they had extra questions, hard questions, real questions. And then they got to the end of it and they said, well, you know, obviously we don't have the whole thing. Obviously, you didn't give us everything. And so we want it in the full thing in Spanish and we want the whole thing in Ishio. And that is your obligation in return for what you get from us. And so he's working on it. And I thought I was glad I didn't have to do it, but I thought, yeah, that's right. That's exactly what you should ask.
I left transcripts with the mothers whose children were stolen. And they wanted it as evidence that they've done everything they could to get their children back. It was
that
wonderful.
Would be especially important for them. You guys, we've gone on an hour and a half.
I have to go right now, but
go.
my contact information is there, and great to see you and glad that you're still sharing your experience.
Well, I actually have never done it like this before. And so it was I was thinking, boy, is this sort of like a lifetime achievement award or in line? But anyway, it was, thank you so much, Emily, for the opportunity to do this. And thank you, everybody, old friends and new friends, for coming. So happy weekend. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming. Danny put in the link for our next event. It's in April. But I'm going to stick around if anyone wants to keep talking a little bit. I know that I'm still just like so stimulated. So I'm not going to close the meeting if y'all want to stick around. But thank you guys so much for coming tonight, and I appreciate it so much.
If I can, if you could let me know your other talks, I'd love to sit in on some of them.
Yeah.
This sounds like a great group. So anyway, I'm going to go. So I hope I don't shut it all down. But
yeah, thank you so much.
Good questions and comments, and bye, everybody.